Hi, students. So, in this review session, we're going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation and these religious wars that are going to come from this Protestant Reformation. So, before we even kind of go into this, let's kind of take a look at first Protestant and Reformation. The root word of Protestant is to protest, and Reformation is to reform. So, really, these Protestant reformers or Reformation people, all they're doing is protesting and trying to reform what is now known as the Catholic Church. What you need to keep in mind are some of the reasons behind why some of these people are protesting. And I mean, we'll get into all the reasons, but just keep in mind that Martin Luther, who's going to be kind of like the father of this Protestant Reformation, he doesn't want to break away from the church. He doesn't want to create a brand new church. All he wants to do is just reform what's going on and correct some of the things that have been happening. So to kind of go in the beginning of all of this, we have to go back to the Renaissance, and this idea of the Renaissance is going into this secular idea. That people are starting to move away, from the church. And if you remember from the Middle Ages, the bubonic plague brought in a lot of people into the church again. Dante's Inferno was bringing people into the church because people were, reading what hell was like and it was scaring them and whatnot. So, and then in the Renaissance, things start to kind of back off a little bit. People are becoming more secular, more worried about what's going on here in the world, in their own lives, rather than what's probably going to happen to them as after they die. So Martin Luther sees that there's a lot of things that he feels that is wrong, or at least a lot of things that are bothering him, so to speak. And one of the major ones is that this thing called indulgences. And what he saw happening was that he saw a lot of religious people, religious leaders, I should say, were giving out indulgences, which were kind of like a get out of hell for free card, like if we're playing, Monopoly or whatnot. And they were selling them to individuals. So Martin Luther's like, but wait a second, how come it's only the people who can afford to get out of purgatory or get out of hell that are getting these? What about all the other people? And let's talk about the poor people. What about them? And then Martin Luther saw just like a lot of other issues that he just did not agree with the church. A lot of his things was kind of like, faith is going to, get you in there and just believing, and that, everyone should be able to read the Bible, not just have the Bible in Latin. So he was talking about a vernacular aspect of this. And obviously, there's so many other ones. His ideas about all the sacraments, that maybe should or should not have been done. In fact, one of the biggest ones is talking about the idea of communion, whether or not, the blood of Christ and the body of Christ actually was that, or if it was just a metaphor. Okay, so Martin Luther's like, no, it's just a metaphor. That's not really it. You don't see it actually turning into it. And this was going obviously against, the teachings of the church. So on Halloween 1521, you see Martin Luther's actually nailing his 95 thesis to the church door in Wittenberg. Disclaiming to everyone his 95 things that he has with the church, and that he kind of wants it to be, reformed. And the Catholic Church is just like, who is this dude? Who's this Martin Luther? Who does he think he is? That he's kind of nailing things up and, saying that there's all of these things wrong with it. And this is where Martin Luther then kind of goes into Germany and just kind of like scrams a little bit and like he's trying to stay undercover until he gets to this diet of Worms, in which then he starts giving up all of his ideas, and Charles V is listening to him, and Charles V's like, what, maybe this guy has a few points to it. Now the church is all in upheaval, because then you start seeing different other groups come out of this. John Calvin starts to come out of this as another reformer. And then you have, Knox over in Scotland, that's eventually going to become a reformer out of this. So different groups start seeing, different, or at least different groups start popping up because of Martin Luther. So the church decides to have a meeting. It's like an 18 long meeting, the Council of Trent, in which they try to come up with all of the different, reforms. What should they listen to? And the only thing they come out of this 18-year long meeting is that indulgences were bad. Everything else that they were pretty much going to keep the same. And Martin Luther's like, so why did I just waste all of this time? At the same time, at least in Germany, you're going to see that the peasants are going to start to revolt and use Martin Luther's name as a reason to have a religious revolt. And Martin Luther's like, get my name out of your mouth. I don't want you using my name for your rebellion. This is silly. We're all Christians. Why are we fighting? And everything like that. So to kind of stop with all of these religious things, you have the Peace of Augsburg occur in the German states, in which the decree said whatever the prince was, that's the religion that you're going to follow. So he was trying to give religious, freedom. But all he really does is, what happens if the prince is, Lutheran, but the people there are mostly Catholic, or vice versa. And this is where a lot of these religious wars or religious rebellions, these peasant rebellions, were kind of coming in with Martin Luther. Martin Luther's like, no, you got to stop all that. Just stop right now. So there really wasn't a right answer, at least at this point, in the German states. And while that's going on, you have the English Reformation, with Henry VIII. And Henry VIII was just known as the defender of the faith by the Pope, and very staunch Catholic. And then he just asked for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, who's a Spanish part of the Spanish nobility, part of that Habsburg family that Charles V, was part of. And the Pope says no, because he gets his arm twisted because Charles V had recently invaded the Vatican. So Henry VIII's like, but wait a second. Why can't I get a divorce or an annulment here, because she's not producing a male heir? She's only given me, a daughter, Mary, who's going to be Bloody Mary eventually. This isn't fair. You know what? That's it. We gone. We're going to create our own church called the Anglican Church, which pretty much almost everything's exactly the same, just about, except you can divorce. So Henry VIII, is not exactly a spiritual person. It was just, hey, I just want to go get married to this girl named Anne Boleyn, who's only going to produce me another, female heir anyway, in Elizabeth I. Okay, it's not going to be to his third wife, Jane Seymour, that he's eventually going to get Edward, his son, who eventually will take over for a few short years before he dies. So that's going to be the English, Reformation. And then you have something going on in France. Okay, you have the Huguenots, which are, French Protestants, going against, the royal family, which is, Catholic. One of the main people there is going to be Catherine de' Medici, okay, and part of the Medici family of Florence, so you definitely know that there is a, Catholics involved here. And what's very interesting is that Henry of Navarre, who's a very kind of like well-known Huguenot, marries into the Medici family, marries one of the princesses, the daughters of Catherine de' Medici. So Catherine de' Medici she does something called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and kills a lot of the well-known Huguenots, except for Henry IV, kind of like stays put just because it's like, the son-in-law. Well, it's going to come to bite her in the butt a little bit, because Henry of Navarre is going to eventually become king once all the older brothers dies and everything, and then he becomes king, but he converts. He says that Paris is worth a mass, and he converts to Catholicism in order to try to keep the peace. But then he passes something called the Edict of Nantes, in which he says, look, everybody in France can now practice whatever religion that they want. Eventually, this Edict of Nantes is going to be overturned by Louis the 14th, but we'll get into that for just for a little bit. Eventually, what's going to happen is that all of a sudden, Henry of Navarre dies mysteriously. It's probably by his wife, who was also a staunch Catholic, and then kind of loses power, and then goes on to like Louis the 13th. Okay. So moving on from France, um, then you start getting the Counter-Reformation people. Okay, so Spain is one of these pure like Catholic countries, and they start with the Inquisition and start going after people that are going after, or talking negative about the church. And then you have other Counter-Reformation people. One of the big one is Ignatius Loyola, who was trying to preach this education, good education of Catholicism in order to bring back into this Catholic faith. So you have all this is also going on during the scientific revolution. So people who started questioning the church's scientific views on things like Galileo, Copernicus, they're going to start to be looked at heretics to the church. So you have so many things that are going on during this Protestant Reformation, even including the Age of Exploration, which is why Spain attacks England, specifically, Queen Elizabeth, where Spain attacks England in the Spanish Armada. And while we're on that subject, let's kind of go back to England a little bit. Henry VIII will die and Edward will take over. Edward was also an Anglican or a Protestant. He will die, and then next in line is Mary, and Mary is a Catholic, and she's been living in Spain, and her husband is Philip II of Spain, just very big, Catholic individuals. So then she starts murdering all of these Protestants in England, which is why she gets the nickname Bloody Mary. But then she dies like within 4 years, and Elizabeth comes in, and Elizabeth's an Anglican, and she changes everything all back again. So that's why then, the Spanish with the Spanish Armada are trying to take over England for that reason, because of the so much back and forth with England between being Catholic and Anglican. One of the big wars that you definitely need to know that's pretty much going to be the final thing is the 30 Years' War, which starts in 1618 and ends in 1648. And it really is at first into 4 stages. Okay, you have your Bohemian, your Danish, your Swedish, and your French. And your Bohemian and your Danish are going to be more local wars, between the Catholics and the Protestants. And your Swedish and your French stages, your later stages, become more of a global or at least European international wars between Catholicism and Protestantism. And by the very, very end, and like I said, you don't need to know exactly every single detail of the war other than, becomes local to, a larger, international. In fact, this was a DBQ question a few years ago, was about the 30 Years' War. But the main thing is that the Treaty of Westphalia, which ends the 30 Years' War, kind of ends all of these religious wars from here on out. And what's interesting is that even though French at one point was going to be Catholic, you have a guy named Cardinal Richelieu, who I'm probably going to bring up during the Absolutism review movie. Review video. What he's kind of doing is this thing called Realpolitik, in which he's putting the country and the country's needs in front of his own personal and political beliefs. Because he is a Catholic, religious leader, he actually at one point fights on the side of the Protestants and not the Catholics. So you're starting to get more interesting ideas and a European generalization of what's actually happening in this time. But know that the Protestant Reformation brings about a bunch of new groups throughout all of Europe. Okay. Yes, it does weaken the Catholic Church with regards to followers and the amount of countries that are now Catholic. It does limit the amount of influence that the Catholic Church and the Pope will have on Europe, okay? But it doesn't... you're still going to have your very strong areas that are still going to be considered Catholic at this time. France, Spain, France after Louis the 14th gets rid of the Edict of Nantes again, Spain, and obviously your Italian provinces. Okay, so but now since you have a weakened religious thing where people are not going to be looking at the Pope all the time for all the answers, it's now going to lead now into Europe to start developing something called absolute monarchs. And that's going to be the basis of our next review video. So you can go on my playlist to go to the next one or look at ones from earlier. You can subscribe and then it will just pop up for you. But thank you for listening, and good luck on your test.